Hello, everyone. Buenas tardes. Good afternoon. My name is Juan Carlos Molleda. I am the Edwin L. Arts Dean and Professor of the University of Oregon School of Journalism and Communication since 2016. It is my entire pleasure to welcome you to our annual Robert and Mabel Ruhl Lecture. The Ruhl Lecture brings today the most influential voices in mass communication to the U of O campus. It's made possible by Robert and Mabel Ruhl Endowment. Mabel created the endowment in 1976 to honor her late husband, a celebrated publisher and editor of the Medford Mail Tribune, which was a historic and incredible valuable local news source until it sadly closed its doors last year. Throughout his career, Robert Ruhl fought for change, earning a reputation as a crusading small-town newspaper editor. Not only did he wage an editorial battle with the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s, but his paper's campaign against a radical local movement earned him the Pulitzer Prize in 1934. We are grateful to the Ruhl family for connecting our students with brilliant professionals who are on the vanguard of our changing news and media industry. Today, we are thrilled to host Jason Rezaian, global opinion writer at the Washington Post, who has spent 544 days wrongfully detained in an Iranian prison when he was working as the paper's Tehran bureau chief. Today, he draws on that harrowing experience to advocate for bring much needed attention to the plight of journalists worldwide who are facing incredible adversity as wrongfully detained hostages. Here to introduce Mr. Rezaian is our own professor of practice in brand innovation and a member of our advertising and brand responsibility faculty, David Ewald. Like Mr. Rezaian, Professor Ewald is a passionate advocate for hostage rights. Over the past 2 years, he has been working with families of wrongful detainees and hostages around the world, using his advertising expertise to help families involved in the Bring Our Families Home campaign to speak out for their loved ones who are being held in Iran, Russia, China, and my home country of Venezuela, and other nations around the world. Mr. Rezaian is a vocal advocate for this campaign and many others as well. Professor Ewald's work helped to create a flag similar to the POW flag, recognizing and calling attention to the situation of hostages across the globe. A recently passed bill, signed into law by President Biden, established March 9th as Hostage and Wrongful Detainee Day, when the flag will be flown on federal buildings around the United States. The work Professor Ewald does is a powerful example of how advertising skills can be used not only to sell products and services, but to drive people to action in the service of worthy causes. He brings his perspective to the classroom, working with the SOJC students on campaigns for societal good. He has also welcomed several influential hostages advocates to speak in his classroom and in his classes over the past year, including Neda Sargi, the sister of freed Iranian hostage Ahmad Sargi, and Vince Kosar, president of Brittany Griner's WNBA team, the Phoenix Mercury. And he has played a huge part in bringing his friend and colleague, Jason Rezaian, to the U of O today. Please join me in welcoming Professor of Practice, David Ewald.
Hey, everybody. I feel thankful tonight. First and foremost, thankful for everybody that's here. And before we go much further, I want to specifically thank a number of people who helped make this event come together. Juan Carlos, I'm going to name all of them by names. Juan Carlos, Leslie, Deb, Julie, Regina, Gretchen, Seth, Damien, Andra, Angie, Kirsta, McKenna, Allison, Chad, Jeremy, and Sydney. The EMU staff that are here tonight, the sound people, probably contract people that we don't know about, but thank you for all your hard work and in making this. Let's give them a round of applause just for making this event come together. So I've thought quite a bit about how to introduce tonight's guest, Jason Rezaian, and whether it's listening through his fantastic podcast, 544 Days, or reading his book, Prisoner, which is available in the back, or even chatting with him over the past few days, I keep coming back to this idea of choices. Our lives are full of big and small choices every day. And just over 2 years ago, a group of families from across the US, united by the threat of a family member being held hostage, made the choice to work together to form an advocacy group. That group, the Bring Our Families Home campaign, was built and continues to elevate the stories of their loved ones as well as many others around the globe. And I'm so thankful to have made the choice myself to work with this coalition of families, to learn about their lives and their stories. And I've learned that in this world of hostage diplomacy, there's many people involved behind the scenes. These are names you won't likely hear in public settings. They're out of the limelight by choice and by circumstance. But if you know, you know. And Jason is one of those people. These families are put in unimaginable positions, often with no direct communication, few, if any, diplomatic channels, and no formal organization supporting them. But in addition to tragedy, the story of American hostages is one of resilience and hope, because these families choose to fight, to put murals of their families' faces on walls across the country, to appear on countless news programs, fighting for the media attention that's so rare and fractured right now. All of it to not forget their loved ones and to make sure nobody else does, including their elected officials, does either. It's a circumstance I know they'd happily change if given the chance, but fighting and having hope and finding a path forward, it's all a choice. And Jason was held hostage in Iran for 544 days. And in many ways, his daily choices were moved by his captors. But he chose to remember himself as a person through those harsh circumstances. He recognized and navigated the gravity, but never forgot his wit and his acerbic humor in Evin Prison, a place that's built to make you forget yourself. And I'm really thankful that Jason chose to never give up. I've read that same fight in the opinion pieces he's written about the many hostages and families that are still deep in their own turmoil. Jason not only chose to share an honest and open version of his own story, but to use his experience to build relationships with these families, to use his platform to advocate and spread their stories, making sure nobody forgets or mispronounces their names, which is something he's quite familiar with. You should look it up, it's funny. I'm also thankful for Jason's patience when, at the annual Foley Foundation dinner, another name you should know, I made the ill-advised choice to accost not only him, but his entire family, to ask what could be the most inconsequential question a stranger could ask about a music credit in his podcast. And while hindsight is always valuable, and I'd do it different if I had a chance, that question was the catalyst that led somehow to this evening tonight. And so I'm mostly thankful that he chose to respond to my follow-up email a few days later, which is very nice of him. Through all of this, Jason has chosen to build on his platform at the Washington Post to illuminate the truth. You can see it in a piece that only Jason could write about Evan Gerskovich, Paul Whelan, and many others, or in the visual forensics work that the Post is doing, ensuring that we have truth at a time when it's so dangerously in question. Or in executive producing a documentary aptly titled Bring Them Home, an intimate look at the Shargi family who have thankfully been reunited. Jason is one of those people that if you know, you know. And I'm so thankful that we have this opportunity tonight to get to know him a little bit more and to not forget that there are more than 60 other Americans being held around the world currently. And I'm thankful that you've chosen to be here tonight, and really excited and grateful to welcome Jason Rezaian to Eugene. So please welcome him.
Good evening, and thank you for being here. And a special thanks to my friend David Ewald, to Juan Carlos, and everybody here at SOJC for inviting me to deliver this year's Ruhl lecture. And to all the students that I've had the opportunity to engage with over the last couple days, your questions have given me so much to think about, and I really, really appreciate it. It's been 30 years since I was last here in Eugene. That was a very different time for me. I was a freshman in college, visiting high school friends who studied at the University of Oregon. And some of them knew exactly what they wanted to do in life. I, however, did not. And it's good to reflect every once in a while on how we've arrived to where we are, the choices we've made, things that have happened to us. Sometimes I tell people I won the lottery of life experience. And a big reason for that luck is that I've chosen unfamiliar paths, put myself in really uncomfortable situations, but never tried to avoid new experiences or new people who were different than me. And that led me to many, many unexpected opportunities, and later to some problems. I don't know if I'd make all those same choices today. It's a very different world, and there are two threats, one to our personal sense of liberty, and the other to journalism, that I want to talk a little bit about tonight. But first, I thought I'd tell you a story. When I was in my 20s, I traveled a lot. I had visited 40 countries by the time I was 25. The dollar was historically strong, and international travel had never been so accessible to so many young people. Using my blue passport felt to me like a very American thing to do, to explore, push beyond what I knew, engage with people of different languages and cultures and beliefs. It may not feel like it today, but those are core American values, always have been. Now, if my dad were alive and here today, and you had the chance to talk to him, you'd quickly notice that he had a strong command of the English language and American idioms, but he also had a very thick accent. So people would naturally ask him, "Where are you from?" And he'd say, "I'm Iranian by birth and American by choice, and I'm proud of both." In a world where we've been told that those two cultures in particular are incompatible with each other, the idea that you could hold these supposed conflicting identities simultaneously became a kind of guiding principle for me. In 2009, I moved to Iran, one of the least free countries in the world, the country where my late father was born. I went there to work as a journalist, and I was pretty good at it. Good enough that I got one of the dream journalism jobs as a foreign correspondent for the Washington Post. Now, Iran is not an easy place to do anything, and certainly not journalism. There are so many obstacles standing in your way, but that never bothered me that much. It made me even more passionate to go and tell stories from there. I was completely undeterred. I did it for years, until one day, my Iranian-born wife and I were arrested from our home at gunpoint and hauled off to prison, where I spent the next year and a half. It was a terrible ordeal that I wasn't sure how I'd survive. And I'm still honestly kind of surprised that I did. I was a hostage, taken because I'm a journalist and because I'm American. It's a unique kind of abuse of power that I was subjected to, and it's happening to journalists around the world as authoritarian and even some democratic leaders show us just how thin their skin really is. Most Americans aren't aware of it, but right now, dozens of our fellow citizens, people just like us, are being held by foreign governments. Not because of any legal violation they committed or any credible allegations against them, but simply because they're American. You might have heard about one of them, Wall Street Journal correspondent Evan Gershkovich. Just yesterday marked 300 days since he was detained in Moscow. What Evan is facing right now feels eerily similar to what happened to me in Iran back in 2014. Both of us are US-born journalists with family backgrounds in the countries we chose to cover. Those connections to the people and the places gave our reporting additional layers of perspective and nuance that most of our colleagues didn't have. But they also put bigger targets on our backs. It's not that Evan and I didn't understand those risks, but that we felt a responsibility to inform, and we believed there was something unique that we could bring the task of doing it. Ultimately, Evan and I chose to do something that at its core is very American. We went to parts of the world that fellow citizens don't know well and tried to paint a picture of it for people back here. Why should you care? People have been taken hostage and used as leverage for thousands of years. It's a problem the United States has dealt with since our earliest days. In his 1805 State of the Union address, Thomas Jefferson talked about negotiating the safe return of American sailors that had been taken hostage during the First Barbary War off the coast of modern-day Libya. In explaining the significance of their liberation, Jefferson said, quote, "In a government bottomed," he meant founded, "on the will of all, the life and liberty of every individual citizen becomes interesting. It matters to all of us." When you hear about the efforts the US government is making to free Evan from Russia and Americans held hostage in other countries, I hope you remember those words. The life and liberty of every individual citizen must matter to all of us. Understand that foreign states do this to Americans because they know our system of government, in theory, places the highest value on each of us to live freely. But I don't need to tell you that in practice, it doesn't always work like that. In reality, being American at home and abroad has never come with greater risks, which is why it's so essential that we push back against the threats that are happening to journalism and journalists everywhere. At their core, these crackdowns on journalists are designed to eliminate the multitude of voices by muting them, with the goal of focusing all attention on one single dominant narrative. Our job today and every day is to not let that happen. One of the biggest current challenges to international journalism, and as a result, our industry's ability to cover growing numbers of countries around the world, is the lack of independent journalists who are able to work freely in the world's flashpoint societies. It's a problem that's facing international news organizations like the Washington Post, but also domestic news ecosystems in increasing numbers of countries. Iran is a perfect example. In July of 2014, my wife and I we represented 2/5 of the English language foreign press in the country until the night we were abducted from our home. Since then, almost 10 years ago, the Washington Post has not had a reporter in Iran for a single day. Back then, I couldn't have imagined that nearly a decade later, the Washington Post wouldn't have returned. That absence puts serious limitations on our coverage, but it was and remains the right call. It's simply not safe for our colleagues to work there. But the effects on other journalists in Iran have been just as chilling, and the landscape has never returned to the relative vibrancy that we once knew. In the void of our presence and the healthy competition that it inspired, the world's understanding of a monumentally consequential period in Iran's modern history is incredibly limited. And that's by design, not our design, but by Iran's leadership. Without international reporters able to tell the stories of a society in flux and shine a light on the repression of authorities, local journalists become easy targets. Same is true in Russia, China, and dozens of other countries. And don't think it can't happen right here. It already is. Which is why we need to double down on our commitments to staying informed, not to just having the ideas and beliefs we're most comfortable with constantly reaffirmed back to us, but to go beyond what we already know in the long quest to better ourselves. It's on every one of us to take that challenge of questioning everything, including especially our own ways of doing things. And that only happens when we engage in good faith and good humor with people we disagree with. It's our best chance at surviving the assault on democracy. Thank you all for coming tonight, for giving me some of your time to listen to me talk about issues and experiences that have informed my life and my work. Thanks so much.
Well, thanks everybody for coming again. And Jason, thank you for being here. And that was a great overview of a lot of different topics. But I wanted to start by looking back at your career with a room full of students. Can you walk us a bit through your early days as a freelance journalist?
Yeah. Everybody hear me? Yeah. Good. I did not take a typical journey into my journalism career. When I started about 20 years ago, nobody was encouraging me to specialize in Iran. And actually, at that time, no young journalists were being encouraged to really specialize in anything. We were taught to be sort of generalists, to understand a little bit about everything, but not so much about any one thing. I think the landscape has changed quite a lot. And these days, it's much more feasible to make that decision that you want to be an expert on one subject or one community and delve into it in your work. So for me, knowing that I wanted to go to Iran and report from there, it gave me the opportunity to shun that traditional path. But it also wasn't a clear path that was in front of me. So I had to get scrappy and figure out how I'd be able to start. And it required a lot of cold emails and showing up at events like this and knocking on doors and writing a lot of things that never got published until some started to. And I think it was probably 6 or 7 years of doing that before I finally felt that I was in a position to just do this.
Yeah. And at the time, right when you moved to Iran, and I've done a lot of digging into your past. I hope that's all right, yeah. You launched a blog as well, right? Iran Solo.
Yep.
.com, I believe. .net.
IranSolo.com.
Yeah.
I went to Iran, so you don't have to.
Yeah, that was the tagline. But I think what was interesting in it, and it's not archived completely, but there's a few bits out there. But you were finding really interesting stories that I think very few people, especially at that time, and especially American in Iran, were finding. And I'm curious how you sort of built those sources and those relationships to sort of find those stories.
One of the things that became really important really quickly when I was traveling and then living and working in Iran was convincing people that talking to me wasn't going to be harmful to them. And sometimes sources would say things to me that I deemed would be potentially harmful for them if it were published in print. And I would tell them. And so I've always had this kind of do no harm attitude towards journalism, which is not necessarily, again, what's been taught. I don't know, how it's taught today, but 20 years ago, nobody was telling you to protect the safety and security of people that you talk to on the other side of the world. It was more, if somebody wants to tell you something, run with it. So building a reputation, and Tehran is a massive city, but it's also interconnected, and there are communities, and I built a reputation as somebody that one was there on the ground, so people understood that this was a long-term situation for me, and two, that was fair. And I think that was sort of the core of why people continued to talk to me and would bring interesting stories to me. So I was able to cover things that nobody else was talking about.
Yeah, and I remember an article about baseball in Iran, and especially you were sort of famously on Anthony Bourdain's show at the time when he came to Iran, and I'm curious, it felt like a very it felt like a kinship relationship as an outsider watching it, and especially after I started reading some of those early articles of trying to highlight different aspects of countries that we may not know a lot about. And I'm just curious what that relationship was like, even as short as it might have been with Anthony. But I think that it felt like a two sides of a same coin.
Yeah. Well,
and also how did that come to be when Anthony's people got in touch?
So it's a good question, and actually, I want to say it was probably 4 years before they actually came to Iran. Before his show was on CNN, it was on the Travel Channel, and the production company is called 0.0, and they're kind of the best in broadcast documentary, entertainment at this point. But back then they didn't have a website. So I had to sort of guess at people's email addresses, and I cold emailed a lot of addresses that I guessed at. And one day after about 6 weeks, I got a response. And I'd said, look, I think it's time that Bourdain goes to Iran. And an associate producer for the show responded and said, I think it's a great idea. He really wants to go. Send us a proposal of what a shoot would look like. And I did that, and actually went to New York and had meetings with the husband and wife team that were his producer and director on all of his shows. And when push came to shove, I think this was in 2005 or 2006, the Travel Channel came back and said our insurance won't cover sending him to Iran. So I was really surprised a few years later when I get this email from somebody I've never met before, a different producer, saying, we're coming to Iran next week, and we heard that you're the guy that we should talk to if we want to, eat good food. And I said, that's true. So I had some conversations with them and kind of fleshed out with really no expectations of any sort of interaction with them when they came. But I told them that my wife and I had set up a sort of very traditional nook in our home that I thought was quite potentially cinematic for their needs, and that I know all sorts of really good cooks who would happily cook for Anthony Bourdain. And they said, we only shoot with local people, and you're not local, and all this sort of thing. Okay. And then the day before they were going to leave, they said, actually, would you and your wife come and shoot a scene with us? I said, yeah, of course, And we had just come back from a trip to Dubai for my wife's 30th birthday, and she twisted her ankle on the last day. And the restaurant that they went to was up in the mountains. And she was like, do we really have to do this? And I'm like, yes, we really have to do this. And I'm so glad that we did, because you're right. There was a special bond that we all kind of recognized very quickly. And when we were arrested a few weeks later, he ended up becoming one of our most vocal advocates in public and also behind the scenes. And then when we got out, he was an incredible friend to us. And we miss him dearly.
Well, and I know I'm jumping around in time a little bit here, but I'm curious if you'd be willing to talk about avocados in Iran a little bit.
This is where my wife would say, listen to the podcast.
Yeah, well, you should listen to the podcast. That's a great.
Listen to the podcast.
Yeah.
So I started a Kickstarter project back in 2010 when I was still freelancing with the idea that I wanted to crowdfund Iran's first avocado farm because, Iran is one of the, I think a lot of people who don't know much about Iran think of it as this big desert country, with camels walking around and no electricity and all that sort of stuff. It's not like that. It's a huge country with a very diverse climate and landscapes, and probably the most developed agricultural industry in that part of the world. And you can grow anything there, but they just didn't grow avocados, and I thought that was really weird. And I'm from California, and I've taken part in guacamole competitions. I mean,
The 2009 Marin County guac-off.
The guac-off,
Yeah.
You have done your homework.
I've done my research.
So, it just became this thing that I thought was a good conversation starter. I had no plans to actually start a farm, but I figured if I raised the $10,000 or whatever it was I was trying to raise, I could probably plant a few trees. Interestingly enough, a couple of weeks ago, I found on Instagram there's a woman in northern Iran who is now growing them.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and she's very into it, and I mean, she's really excited about it, and as a consequence, I'm quite excited too.
We've talked over the past couple days about getting in touch with people. Yeah. I'm curious, have you gotten in touch with her?
I will.
Yeah.
I haven't yet. I've been
Okay.
trying to think about, the approach.
Yeah. Well, this is maybe she'll watch this video someday. Yeah. And so around this time though, and I know again mixing time around, you were arrested very suddenly, and I'm wondering, and again, listen to the podcast, read the book.
Yeah. So, after we shot with Bourdain, so the thing that you have to know is that in 2014, when Iran and world powers, including the United States, were negotiating this big nuclear deal, there was kind of an opening happening. There was more people coming to Iran, both tourists, but also media types to do different shows. Bourdain was one, 60 Minutes came. Andrew Zimmern, you guys know Andrew Zimmern, Bizarre Foods. I was at like the contract stage. Yeah.
Yeah.
They were about to come and do a shoot, and I was going to be their local producer. And food was always kind of in the background. And the night that we got arrested, I was taken to prison, and I'm blindfolded, and I'm being accused of being the CIA station chief in Tehran, and the sort of lead interrogator says, tell us about the avocados. We know that this is code for something, we just don't know what. And then try and explain Kickstarter, even to somebody who's a little bit older than you, in English, but let alone in a foreign language where the idea doesn't translate. So they were harping on this for the first couple of weeks, and finally my interrogator said to me, look, this idea that people that you don't know will give you money to do meaningless things, not possible. So there's a whole website that's like just dedicated to that.
You've been building bridges in multiple directions, you know? Yeah, maybe Iranian Kickstarter someday. So in those early days of captivity, did you, what was your perception? Did they ever talk about why you were being arrested? What
Avocados.
Yeah.
It was the avocados
Right,
that they
yeah.
couldn't find. No, I mean, I think that they were very clear about their cover story, that they thought that I was a spy. But it became clear to me as the weeks went on that I was a hostage, a high profile in the sense that I worked for the Washington Post, high profile American citizen at a time that they were looking to have some leverage against the United States. And I fit the description really well.
And so you were, in the first few weeks, you were held in solitary confinement, but over time, 544 days is a long time.
Yeah.
And I'm curious if you can talk about just some of the relationships that are built in that sort of a situation. And I think especially with you and your background and finding people who are playing baseball and finding really interesting stories, but you're building relationships over time. And I've listened to the podcast, I've read the book, I've talked with you. You build relationships, and I'm curious, with other people who are being held, and even your captors to a certain extent.
Yeah, I mean, what's life if not our relationships, right? I mean, it's everything. And I didn't know how long I was going to be held in there. I knew that I had a limited number of people that I could engage with. I knew that almost all of them, except the people that I was sharing cells with, were my adversaries, or at least represented my adversaries. And, I did the best that I could to cultivate relationships that would make the situation more comfortable. And I'm sure you've all heard this idea of Stockholm Syndrome. As someone who's been through this, that whole concept was designed by people who haven't been through it. When you're thrust into a situation where you not only have no choice, but you have your survival is very much under threat, you find ways to ingratiate yourself to the people who hold power over you. It's just what you do. And I think I'm fortunate that I have, powers of persuasion that not everybody does. And, I use them in that situation to make my circumstances, make my time a little bit more comfortable. And over time, that meant, making fun of my captors, having laughs at their expense with them and without them, talking about them to, you have to understand that the interrogators are true ideologues and the prison guards are just guys doing a job, right? And once you sort of put yourself in their shoes and understand the limits of their own lives, I learned to empathize with all of them. And I'm not ashamed or regretful of that. I saw them as human people, flesh and blood that, were born and are going to die just like me. And I think that was pretty helpful.
Yeah. And we've been talking about perceptions a little bit on this trip, and if you say Iranian prison, and then you listen to the podcast, there's a detail that you have, and in the book, all of the work that you've put out, there's context and there's color that you add to what that means, Iranian prison. And I think some of the stories that are in there, and I'm just curious, how active, I don't know, how active you were in trying to capture those sorts of details even while you were in it, knowing that you would someday get out and perhaps tell your story, maybe not.
It's very important for me. I'm a detail-oriented person and have a pretty strong memory. So figuring out how I would explain aspects of it, I just thought about it the way I thought about any other reporting story, right? When I get out of here, people are going to have a lot of questions, and I'm going to have things to say. And the experience was horrible and traumatic and weird, but not for all of the reasons you assume. Right. And that is, a consistent line through all of my work ever. And I think it always will be.
Did you, and you mentioned earlier, you knew semi-knew the risks of being in Iran as a reporter in particular. Did you have your own perceptions of what it would be like, and then maybe what was different on the other side of it? In the unexpected ways.
You try not to think about it, before it happens to you. Sure. To be honest, I mean, it's not something that you want to delve into mentally too much. Solitary confinement is not something that you just can't imagine it. You can't. In one of the classes, some of you were probably there today, we saw an example of a VR solitary confinement experience. It's not the same. You put on those VR goggles, you could take them off. You can walk out the door. Until you're put in that situation, it's not something that I can explain to anybody. The feeling of powerlessness, the feeling of helplessness, I would say it's the worst thing that you can do to someone's mind. And there's a reason that it's considered torture, because it is. And I hadn't thought about what that might be like. You maybe imagine being incarcerated, but not by yourself in a tiny little box with fluorescent lights on you for 24 hours a day for a prolonged period of time, right, without knowledge of what's going on, what's happening to your wife, and whether or not anybody's trying to come to your rescue. Yeah. It's designed to make you go nuts, and it fucking works. Sorry. Yeah. Sorry, excuse me.
I should say at the beginning of every podcast, you do warn that. I
didn't warn you guys. I'm sorry.
This is we should have done the warning. Sorry. So how did you maintain hope in the 544 days?
Hope is a weird thing. It ebbs and flows, for sure. I think I came close to losing hope a few times. But I knew that, despite my captors' proclamations that they had announced that I'd been killed in a car accident and that nobody cared, I just knew that there are people out there that love me. I knew that there are people that would go to bat for me. Knew that I had like a core family in my mom, my wife, and my brother, who I'd already been through so much with in life that they weren't going to abandon me. And then you get little flashes of hope. You hear something from a prison guard that makes it clear that you've been talked about in a public way. Mm-hmm. I remember I had 2 different cellmates throughout the whole time. And one of them came to me, and he had a daily phone call with his family. And he hung up the phone and came and grabbed me by the shoulders and said, "Obama talked about you last night," And it was like a celebration. It was like the greatest thing he had ever heard, right? And he said, that means, I mean, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about, right? But he said, that means that you're getting out. And it's kind of true. I mean, you know, presidents don't, I mean, David and I know because we work in this space. When the president starts talking about you, you know, the odds of you coming home shoot up.
And Muhammad Ali as well.
And Muhammad Ali. Yeah. I mean, that was, you know, all these years later, still sort of the greatest thing that I could ever envision. And it was the last, the last thing that Muhammad Ali did publicly was call for my release. And the day that I was released, I think was his birthday. And you know, you can see it on Twitter. I mean, he tweeted like, "This is the best birthday present." Like, that's pretty cool, you know? Pretty cool.
So, separate from your experience in prison, the second you were taken prisoner, people were mobilizing around to get you out. And I'm curious, and that includes the Washington Post. It includes your family. How aware were you of that, both at the start but over time as well?
For the first 3 or 4 months, not at all. And you know, my brother was activated immediately. My wife was released after about 2.5 months, and she was in constant contact with my brother and my mom and my employers at the Post. But my brother and the Post were not telling her about anything that was going on behind the scenes because they knew that her phones were tapped and that it wouldn't help her to have knowledge. So, you know, to be honest, she and I were quite frustrated. And, you know, the days and the weeks and months pile up. And this is the sort of thing where there's no good news until you're on the way home, right? I mean, it's levels of hell, right? So yeah, I knew that things were happening. I had indications, you know, my interrogator actually, you know, this problem, I mean, they lie to you so much that when they throw in nuggets of truth, you don't know what to believe. And I mean, it was around the time that the secret negotiations started for our release, he told me that, you know, we're gonna do this big swap. And, you know, we've got some of our guys in prison in Iran and we want them back. And this is how this works. And timeline, it tracks exactly with what was going on. I just, you know, didn't know that little nugget of truth was what it was. Yeah. And on the day that I was released, he said to me, he said, you know, you have no idea how important you are. You know, you've got 15 lawyers in Washington, D.C. Working on it. And I'm just like, come on, can you cut the crap? Like, you know, there's no lawyers. And a week later in Washington, they take me to the law firm that has done all of this work. And I recount this. And the lead lawyer says, can we get a count on how many lawyers billed hours on this? It's 24 lawyers billed hours. I mean, and you kind of blush and, you know, think about all of the efforts and expenses that went into it and wonder if you're worth it.
I think you are. Yes, yeah, I think
Kind
we
of
all
you
do.
said.
We're all here. So after you got out, let me start with, you know, how did you decide to sort of capture the story and tell your story?
I was pretty clear by the time I got out that I wanted to tell the story. That, you know, if I was going to go back into journalism, that I would have to tell the story. It'd be kind of awkward for me to go back to work at the Washington Post and be like, yeah, I'm not going to tell you about that. That's for me. Sorry. But I knew I needed to take my time. And I had really good advice from a variety of people who said, don't go on television and talk about this experience right away because you don't know exactly how you feel about it yet. And that was really solid advice, and I just took the time to go back and report the story as I would any other story. So I interviewed lots and lots of people who were involved, and again, I wanted to paint a portrait of a really hard ordeal, without turning the bad guys into, one-dimensional thugs, right? Just figure out how to maintain the humanity of the bad guys. Yeah. A lot of people don't like that about how I told the story, but that's my story.
That's your story. What was it like, though, to report? Well, to learn about your own story from all of these things that happened without your knowledge, and maybe you had a passable knowledge of some of it, but the details that you eventually get to, that must have been a strange process.
It's strange process because, you also find out that a lot of people take credit for things that they had nothing to do with. And other people who maybe did a lot don't really want to talk about it. Yeah. And there's a lot of, checking one person's story against another's. The one thing that kept coming up again and again and again was, I wish I had a brother like Ali Rezaian, right? And, we're brothers. So I'm not going to give him that much credit up here, but I kind of lucked out. I really did. Yeah.
So how did you, did you take some time off you took some time off when you came back, right? Yeah. Before you started writing again. How did you decide to start writing again?
I wrote, from the second I got out, I was writing. I just wasn't publishing anything.
Okay.
Yeah. It became really important. And when I wrote, did my book proposal and started writing the book, I had all of these Microsoft Word documents of things that I had started. And I went back and read the ones from the early weeks, and I saw so many of them were kind of repetitious. So I figured, okay, these are important things, right, to build around. And then I built a timeline and an outline, and realized that, telling my story in a linear, chronological way probably wasn't the right way to do it. It took me about a year to do the book, and people, ask often, was that a cathartic experience? Absolutely not. There's literally nothing cathartic about writing about your time in prison. The catharsis, and I think that's a weird word, but the value and the power in it comes from after the fact, when you do things like this, and you have a command of the story and the experience, and the nooks and crannies that you don't want to go to. And there's real value in that for me. But in the process of writing, it was so triggering, right? I think I wrote most of the book in 3 to 6 week bursts. And during those 3 to 6 weeks, I would have nightmares. I wouldn't be able to sleep. I wrote the book mostly in a windowless basement in a place that we lived in Washington, D.C. We had a room with windows and stuff, but for whatever reason, that felt like the place for me to do it. And I did it mostly in the early hours of the morning when there weren't people around. I still, if nobody was here right now and I was in this room by myself, I spent so much time pacing, like in squares, and I can see a nice almost square of chairs here. I'd spend hours just walking. It's like automatic muscle memory that just takes me back to that experience and gives me a little comfort. So I spent a lot of time walking in circles or in squares as I wrote the book. But as I got closer to the end of that process, it felt like an accomplishment. And if you've, I'm sure there's some people who've written books in here before. If you do it once, you should do it more than once. Because the process, you learn so much in the process, and it's so hard, and it's so frustrating, and it seems like it's never going to end. And then it does. And you figure out so many things you wouldn't do the second time around. So I'm really excited to carve out some time, hopefully sometime in the next couple of years, and write a book.
Yeah. And so when you started writing more post material, and when you look back at the timeline, and again, I've done my research, when you started writing again for the Post, your work did focus a lot on hostage topics of all sorts, and I'm curious, how, I mean, I know loosely why it would happen, but like how deliberate has that been in terms of advocacy and just keeping these topics, because there are a lot of hostages around the world?
It wasn't something that I planned on doing in the beginning.
Yeah.
The first few pieces that I wrote when I came back were press freedom pieces about journalists in other parts of the world who'd been arrested or murdered. There just happened to be a spate of them right around the time that I came back to work. And my editors were really open to me writing about those. And I think that was kind of them, because these are not the kind of stories that gets lots and lots of clicks, right? People don't care. And so over the last 6 years, I've sort of challenged myself to figure out how to get people to read these kinds of stories. And for me, it's two really unique beats that I know more than most people in this room do about, right? About being a hostage and about the threats against journalists. Yeah. And I learned that the best way to tell those stories is to make those people into human characters. And now that I've moved to the opinion side of the Washington Post, I'm in a really unique space where whether it's Evan Gershkovich in Russia, or Brittany Griner, or Paul Whelan, or folks in Iran or Venezuela, I know that I can write toward the people in power, and they can't ignore it, because all the people in this administration worked on my case, right? It's like, okay, if you did that for me, why aren't you doing it for this other guy? And with the community of people that you belong to and I belong to, we've pushed this issue so far forward with almost zero resources. We don't have a PAC or lobbyists supporting us. You can't see it, but David's got the flag that Juan Carlos spoke about on his pin right there. Soon you might see that at the post office or other places. March 9th is going to be the first What do we call it?
I think it's Hostage and Wrongful Detainee Day.
Hostage and Wrongful Detainee Day. It's like, a really massive sea change in how we look at this issue. And I'm just glad to have been a tiny part of moving it forward, because I know what a really egregious and nasty, just imagine that you go somewhere in the world and you're thrown in prison because you come from here. And then the entire system of a government, all aspects of it. So their law enforcement, their intelligence services, their lawmakers, their executive branch, their diplomats, their judiciary, their propaganda networks, all of them being abused and used to vilify you. And you're just a normal person, right? It's a massive thing to face down. Mm-hmm. And no one should have to face it down. And the way that traditionally we've covered these stories in our press has been, and we did it even with Evan when he was arrested 300 days ago, was, American reporter, Wall Street Journal reporter charged with espionage in Russia. That's the headline. That's not true. Okay, that's the front story, but the truth is, Wall Street Journal reporter taken hostage in Russia. And I will keep banging on that drum until everybody hears it. But fortunately, more and more people have caught on, and I think we're changing hearts and minds little by little.
Yeah. I keep looking at the time, and I believe, okay, and I thought this was the case. We are oddly running out of time this evening. I felt like we were just getting started. But I do want to make sure that we have time for Q&A if people have questions. And there's a mic over there. There's people running with mics. There's a question in the back. Oh, microphone needs to be turned on. There's somebody coming behind you.
Can you hear me? Okay, thank you. I'm going to say a couple of things. I am mindful of time, but I want to say a couple of things and ask a question. At an event talking about threats to press freedom, I think it's necessary to mention Israel's targeted violence on Palestinian journalists in a war that's backed by billions in U.S. Military aid. It's 83 to 100 plus journalists who've been killed. The Committee for Protection of Journalists has called it the deadliest conflict for journalists since they started collecting data since 1992. Whole families have been killed of journalists, and they've continued to do reporting, so I think it's worth mentioning that. And in terms of hostage taking, I guess I wanted to say, I think it's useful to mention that it seems to reflect unequal power dynamics due to US empire. What did this look like in Iran? You certainly know. It meant the overthrow of a democratically elected leader in 1953 by the CIA, installing a secret police and a dictatorship for 25 years, freezing hundreds of billions of dollars in assets of the government, helping Saddam Hussein launch chemical attacks on Iranians during the 1980 to 88 war. And so that leads me to that question. In terms of hostage-taking advocacy, wouldn't it be worth advocating for a change in how the US engages in the world and call for reducing hostilities and normalizing relations with Iran and other countries, similar countries, since hardline approaches and sanctions and threats of war have been counterproductive at best and harmful to Iranian people and many other people at worst? Thank you.
I appreciate the comments and the question. First, I should mention that my wife is the senior Middle East researcher at the Committee to Protect Journalists. So I'm well aware of the dozens of journalists, probably many more than the 80 that you mentioned, who've been killed in the war in Gaza so far. And I'm not really at liberty to talk about efforts to support some of those journalists and their safe passage to other countries, but rest assured, that's something that I support very deeply. On the second part, also, I mean, I've written at length about the need to normalize relations with many of these countries and demilitarize, bring down the tensions. But I guess I would say that it doesn't necessarily mean that I should stop advocating for hostages of my own citizenship. I have a unique position to do that with. And as much as I would like to see the conflicts of the world end today, I don't have the power on those issues that I do on this much more specific subset of issues that we've been talking about here tonight. I wish I did, and I hope for a day when the kind of atrocities that are being meted out in Gaza and other parts of the world stop forever. I just don't see an end to those in sight, unfortunately.
Hi, it's a short one. What do you think of the practices of Guantanamo Bay?
You know who asked me that question a lot? My interrogators in Iran. And my answer to that is, I think that they're abhorrent and deplorable. I don't think Guantanamo should have existed as a detention center in the way that it did. And I think a lot of the ways that other countries like Iran, China, Venezuela, Russia, others have treated American citizens is reflective of that period and the ways that the war on terror was used to suspend very basic rights. But my answer to my interrogator back then, when I was in prison, was that I haven't been to Guantanamo, and I don't think you have either. So I don't feel like it's my responsibility to justify or condemn, although I do condemn those practices.
Hi, thank you so much for being here tonight. I was hoping if you could tell us a little bit about the Washington Post visual forensics program, how that's used to search for the truth, and how that can be used on a wider scale for investigative journalists.
Great question. Visual forensics, if you aren't familiar with, is sort of a new type of investigative journalism where the Post, the Times, and a growing number of news organizations use open source imagery, film, CCTV cameras, posts on social media, satellite imagery to reconstruct events. We've done reports on mass graves in various countries, on protests, on the killing of journalist Shireen Abu Akleh in Palestine a year and a half ago. And the amazing thing is we're able to really get to the bottom of a lot of incidences where we're not able to be on the ground. And I think that this is a really important type of journalism and a breakthrough in how we do reporting. The truth, though, is that it's really expensive and it takes a lot of time. And so when you see something like a protest in Iran or another country where we don't have journalists on the ground and people are pumping out all sorts of raw footage on their social media feeds, and folks say, well, why can't the news organizations, cover this in the same kind of way? Well, we don't have people there. We don't have the ability to vet that information. The visual forensics allows us to do that. And I think it's going to get faster and better and cheaper. But it's really, it's sort of the next phase of how we cover a lot of parts of the world where we can't actually physically be.
Hi there. I'm James. I'm a sophomore. You came into my section of Gateway to Media this morning. Dan Morrison, my professor, went out and talked to you in the hall. Yeah. He came back in and he said, "Do you know who I was just talking to?" And none of us really knew. And he said, "That's one of the most famous journalists in the world." And he began to sort of explain who you were, and he said, "Nah, I'll just bring him in." And after you left, he explained who you were, and not 2 minutes later, I bought my, or secured my ticket for tonight.
Thanks for coming.
Thanks so much for being here. As far as the question goes, I'm a firm believer in the fact that a well-informed electorate is the backbone of democracy, and I believe that it's journalists' jobs to inform said electorate so that they can exercise their power over the U.S. political system by voting. You were asked tonight about maintaining hope. How is it that someone like myself who wants to be a journalist, how are we expected to maintain hope that fundamental change in our news system is possible with the massive spread of mis and disinformation?
It's a really important and grave question, especially as we go into this election cycle. When I talk to people in Washington, I was talking with some friends earlier today about this. There's this attitude that no, everything's going to be okay. You know, our system can withstand, 4 more years of Trump if that happens. All this stuff. I think they're wrong. You believe that an informed electorate is the backbone of our democracy. I don't believe that. I know that. And the fact that we aren't informed and that we're misinformed and that we choose how to misinform ourselves is really the hardest thing for me to swallow, which is why I try and engage in this kind of environment. I know, I stared down many members of Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps and had conversations just like this about things that we didn't agree on. We had deep divisions on. But we were able to talk as human beings. And I think that that's the piece of the puzzle that's coming out of our political landscape and our news media. It's so much talking over each other, so much slandering of one another, and separate sets of facts. They're not separate sets of facts. There is an is and there is an isn't. And I don't have the answer for you, and I'm being very honest. But I do know that for there to be any hope of maintaining of this thing that has been around for the last 247 years, it's going to require breaking bread and shaking hands with a lot of people that have ideas that you can't stand. And it's their right to have those ideas. It's not their right to impose them on everybody else. And I don't know how, I honestly don't know how we re-empower one another. But I'm glad that you asked, and I'm glad you're thinking about that. And I'm glad that so many of you who I've engaged with today have come with really thoughtful questions and ideas. That gives me hope as a slightly older guy.
We have probably 1 or 2 more questions. Going once. So we have one in the back.
Hey, Jason. Thank you for being here today. I just want to build up on something that you said. What are some common ways that we misinform ourselves?
Well, look, I think we choose to believe the things that make us most comfortable, right? When we talk about the crisis at the border, when we talk about the armed gangs that are invading our cities of people that come from south of the border. I mean, these are all ridiculous things. They're taking our jobs. They're taking our homes. They're taking our everything. This is a country that was built on immigrants. I think I can detect in your voice that you come from a part of the world that I know pretty well. And I'm glad that you're here. And I'm glad that, you know, millions of other people from there are here as well, and from everywhere else, because that's what makes this place what it is. It's not looking across the room and seeing somebody that's different than you and saying, I don't want to have anything to do with that person. It's really engaging. What does that guy know that I don't know? And I think we've lost that. It's a really simple thing, and it might sound stupid to come out of my mouth, but I think that that's the thing that we've lost. And it's really something that we should aspire to bring back, to make ourselves great again.
You have a way with words. One more question? One over here.
Hi. I saw you this morning, with Damien. Yeah. I wanted to ask you, I don't know if you answered this already, or maybe in the morning I missed it, but I wanted to ask you, you were the only one, like, not the only one, but like in that moment, you were the only one that they were after. And that means that you have power, and that it's intimidating for them. So why do you think they only go after one person rather than maybe a group of journalists? Like, what do you think made you different to go after you and not a rest of journalists or like a group? Maybe that happens, but
It does. It happened. You know, over the last couple of years, a lot of journalists have been arrested in Iran. But I think they looked at the landscape and thought to themselves, "Okay, this guy's A, he's an American citizen. B, he works for a major American news organization. If we go out and arrest everybody, that looks really bad. If we go out and arrest one guy and accuse him of things that, you know, sound plausible to our society, who we've been telling for the last 40 years that, you know, our country's overrun with spies, maybe they'll believe it, right? And I'll tell you, you know, I've had a lot of people contact me after the fact from Iran saying, you know, on social media, when you read the messages, you can tell who the one, you know, which are bots, which are kind of regime agents, and which are like real people who have an honest question, like, you know, were you or were you not doing this thing? And I engage with them sometimes. And, you know, the security people at the Washington Post would tell me not to do that, right? But sometimes I kind of want to pull at that thread and see what it is that they think. And what I've learned is that the propaganda that these states impose on their publics, even if people are skeptical, it seeps in and it has a real impact. So, you know, I've met so many Iranians over the years, over these last few years, you know, who will say something to me like, well, you know, I was once detained when I was back home in Iran, but they let me go after a couple hours because, like, you know, I wasn't like you. I didn't do anything wrong, right? And it's like, you know, over and over and over again. You know, it's part of the popular lore. And, yeah, I mean, I think they try and make examples out of singular people. And they continue to attack me. They made a 30-episode television series, you know, like a fictionalized series about me. That's like the ultimate, what we call that? Really trolling me pretty hard, you know? It's also kind of flattering, but, you know, except when you see the guy that they had playing me.
Okay, I think we have to cap it at that. We do have a reception across the street in Ellen Hall's atrium. You're all welcome to join. We will have books available. Books are for sale at the back of the room.
Will be available for more Q&A and signing. If you'd like to purchase a book before you come over.
Yeah, and go ahead.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. Thank you.